Having addressed his old accusers, Socrates next moves on to deal specifically with the new ones who have dragged him to court with their graphe Eusebius. Here, he deals with the precise charges leveled against him by Meletus, namely, that he does injustice by corrupting the young, by not believing in the gods of the city, and by introducing other gods into their midst. First, Socrates demonstrates how the accusations of knowingly corrupting the youth are inconsistent with any kind of good sense at all. It doesn't make sense to do that. Since he points out that if he were knowingly to corrupt any one of them, well, that would mean that he himself fully expected to receive bad things back from such corrupted youth in return. Moreover, as the law at that time didn't provide for bringing someone to court for unintentional crimes, there's no reason at all that Socrates should ever have been brought to trial on such an accusation. Second, the accusations of atheism on the one hand, and the introduction of new gods into the polis on the other hand, are easily enough proven to be contradictory. The word used here for the divinities Socrates supposedly brings to Athens is daimonia. Now, for those of you not up on your Greek, understand that daimonioi, or daimonioi, that's the plural, are not what you think of today as demons, like devils, evil or malicious spirits, or corrupting spiritual forces, nor are they spooky horned beasties that you've seen in all those horror movies. In ancient Greece, the word daimon simply designated a being that was more sublime or higher in the order of being than human beings, but less so than God or the gods. A daimon was a divinity of sorts, more than anything like a messenger or an intermediary between gods and men. Most famously, love or eros is spoken of as a daimon in Plato's dialogue entitled The Symposium. In folk tradition, each person was thought to have his or her own daimon, kind of like a guardian spirit. The Greek word for happiness is eudaimonia, which literally means having a good demon. Similarly, if you were a miserable wretch, that was because you had a kakadaimon, or a bad demon. The Greeks spoke regularly of the spiritual element to things and to people's lives, but not in a spooky fashion. In fact, they'd regularly greet one another, calling their especially warm, happy, or spirited friends divine or daimonic men. One thing I've always found alluring about this manner of thinking about ourselves as having a demon is how it helped the Greeks to explain why we often don't know how we ourselves project towards others, how we think we know how we appear to others, but how others quite often see us in a very different light. This is because your own daimon hovers just behind you. You can't see it, but other people are affected by it when they're around you. Kind of makes you wonder about how your daimon will affect the way that you yourself teach, how you will project to your students, to administrators, other teachers, and parents, Only once Christianity took hold in the ancient world did the word demon become abused, or rather, demonized. Christian polemicists changed the meaning and use of the word to make sure that pagan peoples would be estranged from their own mythical language and their spiritual heritage of thought. Essentially, they wanted ancient peoples around them to think that there could only be one mediator between God and men, namely Jesus, not many. And moreover, that all the others, being demonic, were bad or evil. Suffice it to say, then, that our modern-day use of the word demon is full of prejudice and misunderstanding. This makes it particularly hard for us today to understand what Socrates meant when he spoke about his own daimon. And not that the two things are precise equivalents, but here's something I offer to you as a way perhaps to build some kind of understanding of his speech in that regard. For what it's worth, the Christian use of the term angel comes from the Greek word angelos, meaning messenger, a being in between God and men. For your own personal understanding of what they're speaking about in the Apology, then, you might instead think of their discussion of daimonioi, much as though they were discussing angels or guardian spirits. We'll return to the subject of Socrates' daimon later. Needless to say, if Socrates is guilty of believing in daimonioi, something not at all uncommon among the Greek peoples of his day, by the way, then it seems pretty dumb to accuse him of atheism or of not believing in divinities. This is essentially his defense against Meletus, whose case is so weak that it falls to pieces after some very basic interrogation. Indeed, Socrates reiterates how hackneyed is the case brought forth by his new accusers, and how, if anything's going to convict him, it will be the long-standing opinions and unchecked rumors among the many, as they've been affected by his accusers of old. These old accusations are serious indeed, and Socrates fully expects, or rather suspects, that they will lead to his conviction and execution. It's at this juncture, then, that Socrates speaks to his audience about the fear of death, of how such fears might be used to veer people away from doing what is best, as well as about how important the philosophic spirit is to him. Socrates speaks first about the fear of death. How to fear death is actually an excellent example of the false pretense to know what one cannot know. Nobody knows what happens after you die. There are stories and myths and traditions about it, but really nobody knows. So, if you don't know a thing is bad, then why would you fear it? And especially if you know that what you are currently doing is just and good, and that it is in the service of the God that you seek to know yourself, and that you serve your neighbors by encouraging them to seek to know themselves as well, how could you let any such fear, unfounded in any knowledge whatsoever, intimidate you from doing what's best? So, when ultimatums are put before Socrates that he must stop philosophizing, or that he must stop questioning his fellow Athenians, Socrates naturally says it's not possible for him to do that. He tells his audience, I, men of Athens, salute you and I love you, but I will obey the God rather than you. And as long as I breathe and am able to, I will certainly not stop philosophizing. Socrates has made his choice and is unconcerned about all the other consequences that follow from it. In his view, philosophy is the art of caring for souls. As such, there's no greater good in the city and for the citizens than the philosopher who goes around talking to people, both young and old, admonishing them not to care for bodies or money or any of the other goods as much as they ought to care about their own souls and about how they can be the best possible. Socrates might be said to be a teacher at all. It's in this respect, I think. Now, consider your own chosen profession as teachers in training. Consider how, if you're delighted by the figure of Socrates, and if you too wish to become philosophizing teachers, you will, like him, be practicing the art of caring for souls. Already, you must know that as teachers and by law, you stand in loco parentis to your students, that is, in place of their parents. Indeed, you'll very likely be with your students longer during the day than will any of their parents during the school year. Perhaps many of you are already parents yourself. This is a great responsibility to be in place of a parent. And certainly, no parent would likely say that all they do, or all they understand parenting to be, is just putting food in their child's mouth, or clothes on his back, or a roof over his head. Looking after the body is part of what we do, of course, but we also look to the psychological, the cognitive, and the spiritual well-being of our students and children, don't we? But to the classroom, the spirit of philosophy is precisely about these things. It concerns how to prepare and to perfect your soul and the souls of those in your charge. How to help them not to be filled with pretense to knowing, but to come to see the extent of their own ignorance, and thereby to ignite the spirit of inquiry among them. This is your noble calling, inasmuch as you are a teacher-philosopher. And how delightful it sounds to offer such a great good to your students, eh? How delightful, moreover, that we ourselves as teachers are blessed with this opportunity to have a job where the whole day long we might even get paid to wonder and to inquire in this manner, in order that our own souls might be the best they can be. And yet, there's a note of warning here, ladies and gentlemen. It's not all rainbows and unicorns. Philosophy can be rather deadly business, and not such a good career booster either. Socrates uses the wonderful image of the horse and the gadfly to speak about this aspect of the philosophizing teacher's precariousness. He likens Athens, his home city, to a great and well-bred horse that's rather sluggish and sleepy, and that needs constantly to be awakened by some stinging insect. Socrates portrays himself as that little biting fly that goes around nipping at the horse's ears, biting its arse, maybe gnawing on an eyelid, anywhere to wake it up. The image here is of the waking, conscious life versus the life of a sleepwalker. Socrates, in philosophizing, asks us to wake up to what is, not to take everything you see and suppose as real, like you do when you're dreaming, but to question your assumptions and suppositions and to liberate yourself thereby from ignorance of your own ignorance. However, and as we all perhaps know from our past jobs on those tough February mornings at -40, when the wind's howling and the alarm clock goes off for work, sometimes you just want to sleep. Well, Socrates would have us wake up. Socrates, or one like him, is needed to jar that great horse from its slumbers. He sees this as his great, invaluable service to the city and to his countrymen. This is why he says that one like him cannot be but a gift from the God for the city's good. And yet, it is so easy for those irritated by the call to awaken, to simply reach out and slap dead such a gadfly. This threat of extermination remains the case in modern-day schooling as well. Of course, you'll read, and you very likely have already read, about the focus on inquiry in schools, about the emphasis on setting up your class in such a way as to invite free questioning and researching in schools. Reams and reams have already been written on this subject, and we'll read about it in our own class as well, and very likely discuss it in small groups. But the question I would pose to you here is, to what extent is the inquiry that we promote today in schools informed by the spirit of philosophic inquiry, or zetasis, that drove Socrates to his end, and that drove his fellow citizens nuts? I ask this question here in all seriousness. Philosophic inquiry, that real art of caring for souls, seems necessarily to involve stinging and perturbing. Necessarily, it involves questioning all the underlying assumptions and presumptions that we harbor about the most important things, even regardless of how these things serve the bulleted outcomes on the program of studies or the curriculum, even regardless of whether or not philosophy might indeed undermine and tear apart all such bullets, pointing out the deep underlying ignorance that may rest at their base or foundation. What if, for instance, philosophizing in your classroom and the practices of waking up lead you into conflict with the prescribed mandates and pedagogical approaches demanded of you by your school administrators? What if your inquiries lead you not to be able to accept some of these things? What if you as the teacher begin to appear to be not a team player in your school? What if, as the philosophic spirit inhabits your classroom and begins to gnaw on the arses of others, it leads students to inquire, to question deeply held convictions or aspirations foisted upon them by their parents or by society? What if philosophy does not make kids better able to come up with the correct or at least expected answers demanded from them in mass education? What if, in the process of educating in this manner, they demonstrate on their exams, yikes, the extent of their own ignorance rather than concealing it and focusing upon demonstrating only what they know? What if their marks suffer due to how they begin to question and to problematize their previously unquestioned assumptions? What if, rather than being taught to be movers and shakers and agents of change and success stories in the competitive world of business, or where what counts is doing and making and getting stuff done, what if, instead of this, the philosophic spirit overtakes them and causes them to stand back, to pause, to hesitate from acting on goals and objectives that, after all, they don't really know for certain about their nature in the first place? What if philosophy necessarily leads a man to poverty and walking shoeless in the streets, or on the march from Paideia, as it did in the case of Socrates? Do you see what's at stake when we become philosophers in the classroom? And I don't mean when we simply put on airs. Anyone can ask big questions. Anyone can encourage dialogue. Anyone can set up his or her classroom to teach kids how to come up with their own questions and how to do research, how to inquire, to test hypotheses, and to present their findings. Again, there are reams of books you can read about that. But I'm talking here about the genuine spirit of philosophy. How many of you are willing to stake your futures on it and to invest yourselves in it, not simply as one technique of inquiry among many in your teacher toolbox, but rather as a way of life? Here again, we're speaking about the courage that is needed for you to be a teacher. Socrates is such a good model for us of courage. What is courage? Aristotle talks about courage as a moral virtue, as a kind of middle ground, or mean, between the two extremes with regard to what is fearsome. When we're on the deficient side of the spectrum and face our fears, we do so as cowards, running away from and unable to do what is best because of it. We literally sin or miss the mark or bullseye of virtue. The Greek word coming from archery for sin is hamartia. Similarly, when we are completely fearless in the face of what is truly fearsome, we behave not with courage, but recklessly or brashly. Indeed, without feeling any fear or recognizing what is truly fearsome. One can't ever be courageous. Well, philosophizing or pursuing wisdom in your own teaching practice is also the way that you will come to be truly brave. For the philosopher seeks not just to act, to be decisive, firm, and effective in his acting. Let's leave that to the big shooters and administrators. No. The philosopher wants first to know what is, and he only wants to act if his actions can be informed by that knowledge of what is. Indeed, one can see right here in this example just how little patience there might be for a philosopher teacher in the school system. For all that, Socrates acted quite a bit in the world. He wasn't a dilly-dallyer. Socrates participated in battles as a soldier. He did his civic duty when called to do so under the very tough times, and when the 30 tyrants were in power. And of course, Socrates acted even in his daily mission to inquire into the truth about things, with whomever he would talk to him. Socrates was therefore not stultified for action. Indeed, he talks in this regard about the significance of his divine sign, or his daimon, which comes to him whenever he is about to embark on an action that is not appropriate or good. Socrates hears this voice, and he abides in its advice, which never turns him towards an action, but only ever away from a thing. Perhaps this divine thing of which Socrates speaks is something like what we nowadays mean when we refer to our consciences. It has some resonance with conscience, at least. So, the question I would pose to you here is, as teachers, how carefully will you listen to your conscience and allow it to dissuade you from actions that you might take or that others might expect from you in a classroom setting? And moreover, how much are you willing to stake on the inviolability of such a voice from within? In approaching our study of the Apology as wannabe teachers, I've presented the figure of Socrates as a model or paradigm for us. I stand by this choice. However, we should not forget that in his own defense speech, Socrates explicitly says, "I have never been anyone's teacher." What does he mean by that? I've never been anyone's teacher. Is Socrates serious? Is he lying here? Is reading him in the B.Ed program then not a complete waste of our time as people interested in the profession of teaching? Let me clear things up a bit for you, given this perplexing statement. Socrates, you will remember, has been accused of being a wise guy or a sophist. He's accused of setting himself up as a teacher who knows some special kind of knowledge that he can teach his students, and that they can then go on to use, go out in the world and conquer the world and make big bucks to be successful, or maybe just to raise hell with their parents, maybe just to spit in the face of authority and to undermine valued traditions and democracy. At any rate, the greatest crime leveled against Socrates in the writ of piety in the writ of impiety, is that he has been a teacher, and in that capacity, also a corrupter of the young. Well, as we've already seen, Socrates doesn't profess to know anything. He asks questions. He doesn't tell people what to think. He explicitly rejects any notion that he has some kind of special wisdom. Following Pythagoras, he says only the god is wise. No. Although Socrates certainly seeks wisdom, he disclaims ever having any knowledge of what the content of such wisdom might be. In fact, the desire for wisdom is what defines the philosopher. For the philosopher is literally a lover or desirer of wisdom. He loves and desires wisdom because he needs it. He wants it very badly. And this want is a clear indication that he doesn't have it, that he lacks it. So why would you want something you already have it? If you already have a sandwich, then you don't need a sandwich, right? Well, if you already have wisdom, then you wouldn't be seeking to have it. Philosophers, then, are not wise men. They're not sophists, already ostensibly in the possession of wisdom. Sophists presume to know. For that reason, they've given up on seeking after wisdom. They don't want to know, because they already claim to know. And they'll teach you too if you can pay. Socrates isn't that kind of teacher, to be sure. But not every teacher is like a sophist. If you're a carpentry teacher, you know all about your trade. And you teach it to others, right? You have a knowledge base. You're an expert in your field. But teachers aren't just experts. They have to be something more than an expert, really, because lots of experts can't teach. A teacher must be able to explain, to coach, and to model for students who are novices, not experts, how to work within this or that discipline, art, or science. As teacher professionals, we have to know our stuff, don't we? And it pays off to be an expert in what you do. If you don't know your math, for instance, it's going to be really hard to teach mathematics to other people. Or if you don't know anything about history, it's not going to be very easy to lead a discussion on history. I personally see teacher expertise as something that's being belittled in today's education policy environment. For instance, our government here in Alberta likes to say nowadays that teachers can't be called upon to be experts in their fields anymore, that we lack the requisite training, know-how, and abilities, that most of us aren't capable of knowing our fields, that knowledge is changing in such a fast-paced way today, that what's here today is gone tomorrow, that the information age is upon us, and generally that knowing anything in particular doesn't stand at the base of what we do as professionals so much as knowing how to get at it, or where to find the latest information about what students need to know. So teachers, are kind of like Google moderators when it comes down to it. Officially, and you see it quite clearly if you bother to read the 2010 Inspiring Education Report, officially we're not ever to stand before our students as experts, although certainly we may call experts into our own classrooms as guest speakers. Rather, we're repeatedly called upon to understand ourselves as architects of learning. This is the new lingo in the field of education, at least. However, expert disciplinary knowledge must remain the foundation of teaching, like it or not. And I say this with the sheer weight of thousands of years of tradition and common sense behind me. In order to teach something, you must know it. Let's not forget that. That is a simple insight that easily gets lost or buried under a tidal wave of words and policy statements. But more than this, teachers as human beings with the innate desire to know, we love the truth. And as teachers in this or that specific field of inquiry, they've lived a certain length of time, and they've come to see things through their hard-fought efforts in this regard. Their love of discipline-specific truth and their desire to know what is in this or that art or science has reaped certain fruits for them. Teachers, in order to be teachers, must be passionate in their love of what is, in their desire to know. Any fruits of knowledge that they find themselves able to harvest within their disciplines arise from the spiritual activity of loving and desiring to know the truth. Any expertise they develop in their field arises from this basic recognition of teaching as a deeply spiritual profession. But teaching is not simply contemplative in its nature. That is, as teachers, we don't want the truth all to ourselves. We don't want to revel in a vision of what is, all by our lonesome. Our love is communal. And as public school teachers, we seek out what is the common good. The Greeks called this ta koinon. So, teaching has an active component to it as well. As teachers, we love our disciplines and we are excited by disciplinary learning. We seek to share that love of learning and that vision of what is with our neighbors, that is to say, with our students. This sharing is one of the great joys in teaching, where a teacher has developed that intimate relation with his or her students, and where he or she takes delight in passing down to them what can be known through the practice of this or that art or science. This delight in seeking the truth and then passing on what has been seen as an expert or as someone who knows is an essential component of teaching. We must not forget this, for at times, and with the ever-heightening faith in technology that's infected teaching systems, we're encouraged to believe that really the teacher isn't necessary, that only an architect is necessary, or a structural, technologically mediated form or process through which students might pass to gain competencies. That, perhaps, much of the expertise and autonomy of teachers in their profession must be outsourced, or might be outsourced, to machines and databases and programs. This directive in teaching, and it seems to me to be a powerful one, overlooks the essential nature of teaching as a spiritual practice, in which the teacher passes on joyfully what he or she knows and what he or she has seen to his or her students, out of a loving hope that they too will be ignited with love for what is. Back now to Socrates. Socrates is neither a sophist teacher, nor is he the discipline-specific teacher who hands down what is already known or established. Socrates is no kind of teacher like this at all. This is what he means when he says to the men of Athens, "I have never been anyone's teacher." Socrates' manner of inquiry, his deitasis, is not directed at passing down something already known, but instead seeking to know what one does not know. He wants his audience to understand, in other words, that what they think is the substance of his teaching isn't at all what he is doing at its core. And this doesn't mean that he has no interest in teaching anyone either. At 35c, Socrates even says that the proper functioning of a speech before his judges is to teach, didaskein, and to persuade, pethein. On the other hand, he's quite serious that, apart from all the other sorts of teaching and arts and sciences and disciplines with which one might busy oneself, the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. Now, this is a very strong statement, ladies and gentlemen. Very many of you would be appalled if perhaps someday one of your own students told you that her life was not worth living. How terrible! And what a lie to say about one's life. Just because one doesn't know oneself doesn't mean that one's life is not worth living, eh? What is this? Some kind of call to teen suicide? Of course, Socrates means no such thing. He's not calling for teen suicide. What he does mean is perhaps something akin to what Paul says in Corinthians. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have the faith that can move the mountains, but I do not have love, I'm nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but I don't have love, I gain nothing. Without, in short, this love of wisdom in our hearts, and without having it as the prime motivator behind our inquiries, no matter how successfully we set up our classrooms for inquiry-based learning, no matter how inquisitive we are, how successful we become in our activities, in our achieving of our goals, our dreams, our ambitions, no matter how much other knowledge we acquire in this life, if we lack the deep knowledge of self that knows what it does not know, and that pursues that wisdom which only belongs to the God, then we are indeed nothing, and our lives have been wasted on shadows and wind. Let us therefore ruminate on how we can bring the dulcet God's demand to know ourselves to life in our own classrooms as we turn to teaching. Let's hope to cultivate the necessary courage for such a way of life, as well as the thankfulness and the gratitude that underlie such a way of life on our way to becoming very fine teachers. Thank you for listening.